This is the story of Shopee. It was the year 2015, and Southeast Asia was changing. The region had over 600 million people who were getting access to smartphones for the first time. There were a lot of opportunities in this market, and one of them was online shopping. The problem was that there wasn't a single online marketplace that served the entire region. There were many marketplaces that served individual countries like Indonesia, but none that served the entire area at once. This is when a young CEO, named Forrest Lee, set out to change everything. The new platform would be called Shopee. It would be an online marketplace, connecting buyers and sellers from all over the world. The plan was to expand throughout Southeast Asia and become the Amazon of the East. But unlike Amazon, which focused on everything, Shopee would focus specifically on mobile commerce. They wanted to make it easier than ever for people to buy things with their phones. The company was launched in June of 2015, and it didn't take long for it to gain traction. In under 2 years, Shopee became the largest e-commerce platform in Indonesia. In 2017, they raised $1 billion in funding, and in 2018, they were valued at $5.7 billion. Their rapid success can be attributed to a number of factors. First, they offered a very competitive product. By aggregating millions of products from all over the world into one place, they gave customers the best selection possible. On top of that, they had plenty of room to grow. Since e-commerce adoption was so low in Southeast Asia, the entire region was essentially untapped. And finally, they had the backing of some big players. Shopee was founded by Sea Limited, which is a Singaporean, multinational technology company. In other words, Shopee had almost everything they needed to succeed. But one thing they didn't have was profit. Even though they had the biggest market share, they weren't making any money. And this brings us into today. Today, Shopee is one of the most popular apps in Southeast Asia. It has 397 million active users who make 4.2 billion visits every month. It has over 15 million merchants, and it operates in 7 different countries. But even with all this success, Shopee is not profitable. They've been burning cash at an alarming rate. Last year alone, they lost $1.5 billion. At this rate, they won't be around for much longer. So the question is, how did this happen? How did such a dominant company fail to turn a profit? Well, let's go back to basics. What does Shopee do exactly? Well, Shopee is simply a marketplace. They don't produce anything themselves. Instead, they allow third parties to list their items on the site and connect buyers and sellers. Now, you might think that this is a great business model because you don't have to deal with production or logistics or customer service. You basically just provide the platform and collect commissions. But in reality, it's not that easy. While Shopee does collect commissions, they don't bring in a ton of revenue. That's because their commission rates are quite low. According to reports, Shopee charges a flat fee of $1 for each listing. So if you want to sell 100 items, it will cost you $100. On top of that, they also charge a commission fee ranging from 2 to 8%. So overall, Shopee isn't a great place to make money unless you're selling high-margin items. But we're not talking about Shopee's seller economics today. We're talking about their overall economics. And in order to understand their economics, we need to look at what they actually offer. And here we have to talk about the freebies. Shopee is known for giving away insane amounts of free stuff. If you look through any of their ads, you'll see that they always include some sort of free item. Sometimes it's a TV, sometimes it's a car, and sometimes it's even an iPhone. Now, you might think that this is a good thing. After all, who doesn't like free stuff? But the truth is that it's terrible for the business. Just think about it. Would you want to work twice as hard just to get paid half as much? Probably not. And that's essentially what these freebies are doing. They're cutting Shopee's revenue in half. Every dollar that they earn, they have to give 50 cents away. And they're not the only ones doing this. Lazada, their main competitor, does the same thing. In fact, they probably do it even more. Now, you might think that this is just a phase that they're going through, something they have to do to compete, but the truth is that this is the whole point of their business. You see, Shopee isn't really trying to build a sustainable business here. They're trying to build a lottery ticket. Their goal is to capture as much market share as possible, not necessarily to turn a profit. And for that, they need to burn a ton of cash. That's why they're constantly raising money. The only difference between Shopee and a pyramid scheme is that Shopee is slightly less evil. Instead of depending on recruiting people, they're depending on VC funding. At this point, you might be thinking that this is all on Forrest Li, that he's just a greedy CEO looking for a quick buck. But the truth is that this is nothing personal. It's just business. Forrest Li didn't create Shopee to make money. He created Shopee to make money. The truth is that he never planned on turning Shopee into a profitable business. He always planned on selling it. Look, you don't start the biggest e-commerce business in Southeast Asia just to run it forever. If you did that, you would be Jeff Bezos. Forrest Li didn't want to be Jeff Bezos. He wanted to be worth billions. And in order to do that, he needed to build a giant company that could eventually be sold for tens of billions. There's nothing wrong with this, by the way. This is literally the entire point of venture capital. Entrepreneurs use VC money to grow their businesses as large as possible, and then they sell it to someone who wants to run it as a real business. But here's where things get messy, because Shopee isn't a normal business. They're not a tech company. They're not a retail company. And they're not a logistics company. They're a combination of all three. If they were a normal tech company, they could easily be sold to Meta or Google or Amazon. But Shopee isn't a normal tech company. They have real-world operations and infrastructure and assets. If they were a normal retail company, they could easily be sold to Alibaba or Walmart. But again, Shopee isn't a normal retail company. They operate entirely online. So what is Shopee? Well, Shopee is essentially a technology-driven flea market. Now you might think that this is a weird way to think of their business, but hear me out. A flea market is basically an online marketplace. It has third-party sellers, no return policy, cheap products, and most importantly, very low margins. Now imagine if someone came along and tried to buy out your local flea market. Do you think it would be worth much? Probably not. Most likely your local flea market would be worth pennies on the dollar compared to the actual price. And that's essentially what's happening with Shopee right now. They're trying to figure out what type of buyer would be interested in buying them out. Whether that's a tech company, a retail company, or maybe even a private equity firm. Once they find the right buyer, they can strike a deal, and Forrest Li can walk away with billions of dollars. Now you might think that this is a bit cynical, and you might be right, but there's a method to my madness. Look, it's easy to bash on companies like Shopee and call their founders greedy, but that's not really fair. It's no secret that they're trying to sell the company, and anyone who invests in them knows this. In fact, most investors are probably rooting for them to lose money. The more money they lose, the cheaper the acquisition will be. So ultimately, Shopee has to balance two things. They have to keep losing money to make the acquisition cheap, but they also need to stay afloat. Now, given the current situation, I don't think Shopee will survive for much longer. Most tech companies are pulling back on advertising, and Shopee is no exception. In fact, they've cut their marketing budget by 50%. On top of that, inflation is hitting consumers hard, and they're pulling back on spending. As a result, Shopee sales are down 25%. All in all, I don't think Shopee will last another 2 years. In the meantime, they'll probably try to strike a deal with a local telco or private equity firm. But after that, it's game over, and that's why.